The film begins with Scott Huffman, a political staffer for the Pentagon, getting trapped in heavy traffic while traveling to the hospital with his wife and son for a checkup. When Scott gets the call, his assistant tells him that a high-ranking official has suddenly resigned. Understanding the circumstances, Mrs. Huffman gives her husband the go-ahead to use the metro to work. When he gets to the Pentagon later, his secretary gives him an overview of the day's plans right away. He is going to have a meeting with Thomas Tully, Master Sergeant. Stanton, Scott's friend and colleague, assigned him the task of investigating a posthumous Medal of Honor request for William Pitsenbarger and getting it over with. Scott reviews the documents and informs Tully that William has already been awarded with the Air Force Cross. Tully justifies that William deserves the Medal of Honor, the highest award that can be given to a serviceman. Tully follows Secretary Peters to the comfort room after the meeting so they may discuss the case. To be honest, Scott was unable to devote much of his time to the Medal of Honor request. There was nothing he could gain from such arduous labor. Secretary Peters, however, has other plans. He summons Scott to his office, gives him the go-ahead to personally gather combat testimonials, and has him compile a thorough examination of decorations. Scott works on the Pitsenbarger case and leaves town because he doesn't have many options. Rewind to the height of the Vietnam War. A company of troops is ambushed as they are unexpectedly patrolling the deep forest. A fierce firefight ensues, and after the grunts of the jungle take losses, they radio for an injured evac. Moments later, the rescue helicopter arrives and starts carrying the injured one by one. But it's taking too long since the U.S. soldiers below don't know how to load the litter's reason for that is because the first wounded on board is the medic, the only person that had training regarding the matter. And so, to speed things up, William Pitsenbarger volunteers to go down and help. At present, Scott first visits the Pitsenbarger together with Master Sergeant Tully. He interviews him about his side of the story. Following a brief conversation, Frank, William's father, tells Scott that he needs to speak with the soldiers in Abilene in order to learn the truth about the situation there. The Big Red One, or Charlie Company, 16th Infantry, surviving members. Frank advises him to begin with Lieutenant Billy Takota, who was there at the moment. In order to find Takota, Scott soon travels to a rural place 1 hour distant from the Pitsenbarger home. He ventures far into the forest and follows the river's flow. Scott yells, "Not a soul in sight." It seems to have succeeded, as Takota appears on a boulder and motions for Scott to approach. Turns out the veteran was fishing with his grandkids. Before they start, Scott takes out an audio recorder. The old veteran then takes it from Scott's hand and throws it in the river. Takota then starts revealing that he loved the rush of war, but the encounter in Abilene made him think otherwise. Another blast from the past. A young Takota carries one of the wounded to safety. But on the way, he gets shot in the back. As they were eliminated one by their Vietnamese counterparts, a large number of the soldiers died in the interim. Takota calls for assistance and uses the radio to report the situation. At that point, Takota sees William getting out of the helicopter and, in spite of intense gunfire, begins leading the evacuation of the wounded. Returning to the river, Takota reveals that it was he that suggested William be awarded the Medal of Honor. Takota goes on to say that he simply pointed to the painful gunshot wounds on his back when a buddy inquired about the conflict. After that, Scott keeps working to find the other members of Charlie's company. Scott shows up at Jimmy Burr's house shortly after. Jimmy's wife, Donna, comes up to Scott and lets him know that Jimmy doesn't get up until 8 in the evening. Donna then explains that her husband has PTSD and 50 other war-related effects from Vietnam. Jimmy couldn't sleep during the night, hence he sleeps during the day. Scott then asks Donna for the list of the men from Charlie Company that she tracked over the years. The political staffer falls asleep waiting for Jimmy. Later, Jimmy comes to his car to wake up Scott. After a brief exchange, Jimmy fires his gun to show the young man that his gun's loaded and starts getting agitated. The old veteran then reveals that he's been in service for 10 long years, but hasn't fired a single shot until Vietnam. An unpleasant memory from the past. While patrolling the dense forest in Abilene, a young Jimmy starts a conversation with another soldier, and Lieutenant Takota scolds them to keep their eyes open. Not soon after, the Viet Cong ambush starts. Jimmy uses his shotgun for a kill. Jimmy begins to throw up when the team looks closer and notices that the enemy corpse's entrails are hanging out. Scott will return to the Pentagon soon. He queries his secretary about the conditions for a review of a congressional decoration package. First, a fresh eyewitness account is required. The second is the DoD casualty report. The endorsements from the chain of command come last. Although Scott owns the first two, he was unable to determine what had happened to the last one. The approval of the chain of command. Later, Scott meets up with another Charlie Company veteran named Ray Mott at the firing range. The veteran explains that shooting up things keeps him sane. Then he starts sharing his side of the story. Ray shares that William was part of the Air Force and shouldn't have been there. The battle hero yet stayed to support and fight with strangers. They carry on their discussion while Ray drives a school bus for a living. Hundreds of enemy fighters were crawling all over the ground and up the trees as Charlie Company was ambushed in the past. Ray realized at the moment that they were set up and had no chance of winning. Stanton is informed about the lost command endorsement file by Scott when they are playing basketball together. He goes to the Pitsenbargers to get to know William a little better. They watch a few films, then William's parents give their take on when William joined the service. It got emotional when Frank went up to William's old room and started sharing his fair share of regrets. Something changed in Scott by the time he got home. He wondered how a man like William, who had everything, left home with such certainty that no bullet was going to stop him from who he was. Dakota, meantime, finds it difficult to fall asleep and begins to recall the past. Troops from Vietnam begin to plunder the fallen soldiers. Dakota gives his soldiers the command to pretend to be dead and begins dragging dead bodies on top of them, knowing full well that they are encircled. William later cries out to anyone in the vicinity to check on their survival. Jimmy answers back. Jimmy is urged by William to assist him in carrying Dakota to safety. Despite being struck in the shoulders, the courageous airman manages to rescue the lieutenant and tend to his wounds. Dakota phones Frank in the middle of the night, but she is unable to speak. Instead, Dakota grabs his car keys to visit William's grave. Back at the Pentagon, Stanton walks up to Scott and tells him news that he's up for a promotional interview. But Scott was hesitant and wanted to finish the Pitsenbarger report. During Thanksgiving, the Pitsenbargers visit Scott and his family. Later, Dakota pays Scott a visit as well. The veteran hands Scott a new audio recorder and then presses the record button. Dakota then reveals that he made a crucial mistake when he radioed for artillery support. He admits that he got the distance correction wrong, and it led to friendly fire, killing a few U.S. soldiers. And for years ever since, that 20-second mistake has haunted him. Scott continues to review the audio recordings of his interview to further look for clues regarding the command endorsement that was filed 32 years back. One name always pops up, Kepper, aka Sergeant John C. Kepper. With no other choice, he visits the man in Vietnam. Soon, Scott travels far into Vietnam's breathtaking countryside. He soon arrives at Kepper's modest forest home. Kepper went on to say that although he wasn't religious, William Pitsenbarger was the answer to his prayer for a miracle during the Abilene encounter. Despite the tumultuous situation, William remained composed and assisted Kepper, who was severely hurt. Kepper goes on to say that Mad Matty Holt, the company's COO, was the one who came up with Operation Abilene, likewise called Colonel Holt, known as Senator Holt at now, a powerful person who could one day be appointed Secretary of Defense. Kepper gives Scott a tour of the region. He currently earns a living by altering the perspectives of veterans who wish to live in the past, change the bad memories into good ones. Kepper then shows a beautiful greenhouse he made with tons of beautiful flowers and butterflies. Turns out the conservatory was the place where William Pitsenbarger came down, there in Abilene. Scott gets teary-eyed and lets go of all pent-up emotion within him. A beautiful spiritual awakening of acceptance. During Operation Abilene, the U.S. grunts were surrounded from all sides. After fixing up Ray, William hands a letter to Ray and tells him to send the letter to someone in case he doesn't make it. William then takes off his jacket and covers Ray with dead bodies. The brave airman then continues to find soldiers to help, but gets shot multiple times in the process, killing him instantly. A few days later, Scott breaks into Stanton's office and discovers the endorsement from the chain of command he has been seeking, and the entire plot came to light. Stanton really withheld the recommendation letter out of fear that it would expose Operation Abilene. During one of the bloodiest periods of the Vietnam War, the senator's reputation might be impacted by this setback. Stanton assigned Scott the job because he believed that Scott wouldn't take such a menial task seriously, and that it was his duty to shield the senator from scandals that his political rivals might exploit. After making the decision to retain the data and incorporate them into his research, Scott is threatened by Stanton that he would destroy his career. The day of Scott's promotional interview came. During the interview, Scott wasn't as pumped. He desired no position unless he finished what he started. Scott intentionally flunked the interview so that he could continue with William's Medal of Honor recommendation. That evening, Scott meets with Tully and shares his fair share of trauma. He's trying to help Tully by forcing the veteran to own up the pent-up feelings he couldn't convey to anyone else. At first, Tully gets aggressively defensive, but soon breaks down. Tully admitted that he was glad that it wasn't him who died, and that he was ashamed for feeling that way. The following day at the country club, Tully and Scott pay Senator Holt a visit unannounced. Nonetheless, the senator welcomes them, and Scott then fills in the details to the senator about what happened. The senator admitted that he doesn't know how the recommendation fell out of the cracks. There are various reasons, but he'll see to it. At the Congress, the senator tries to convince everybody present to get William the posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor for his valor during the Vietnam War. The opposition shuts down Senator Holt, and the chairman closes the case. Scott goes home defeated and shares the details with his wife, but his wife encourages him to take a leap of faith. Later, Scott meets with Secretary Peters to report his findings and decides that he'll go public with the story. Peters tries to warn Scott that he'll be treading in deep waters, but either way, Peters will support him. Scott goes live on television and accuses the senators and staffs of playing political football on military valor, and it gets nationwide attention. A few months later, the bill allowing the late William Pitsenbarger's posthumous award was signed by the president. Soon, everyone involved in the war, including veterans, attends the award ceremony. Ray returns the letter that William gave him to its proper owner 32 years ago. Will's parents received the Congressional Medal of Honor from Secretary Peters shortly after. As the film comes to a close, the secretary thanks the Operation Abilene War veterans for their years of dedication in making this day possible. The older men got to their feet. The secretary also demands that everyone impacted by one man's conduct, including veterans of the conflict and the Williams Unit pararescues, speak up. Following the ceremony, Frank gives Scott his son's watch. Thanks for watching.